Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you so much for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for the worlds that Obsidian has created for us. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me as we dive into another episode of the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 and the game of Avowed. If you're wondering why those games are paired together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so if you're new here, welcome to the show first off. This will be a good first episode for you to jump in on. Sorry for those of you who have been listening for a long time that I'm late putting out an episode. I was officiating my brother's wedding this weekend, which, I don't know, a humble brag or something. But either way, I was pretty preoccupied with that and then had the rest of the regular stuff to catch up on. But thankfully, here in Canada, this is actually Thanksgiving weekend, so I had an extra day in the weekend to actually get some of this done. So I'm able to get this episode out here for you thanks to that. If you are new, perhaps check out episode 0 to learn where some episodes about the foundational lore of this world is, but if you want to start here, you're more than welcome to. In today's episode, I am going to be looking at Ghost Heart Rangers, which is a particular subset of the Ranger class that we see in Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire, and I'm specifically looking at how you can roleplay as one in the game of Avowed. So it's going to be kind of a mixture of lore from Pillars of Eternity 2 and lore from Avowed and seeing what the overlap is there. Ever since beating my third playthrough of Avowed, I've been very interested in looking at how you can play certain characters from the Pillars of Eternity games in the game of Avowed, or certain classes or archetypes of characters in the game of Avowed. I've asked, like, can you play a druid? Can you play a particular type of rogue? Could you play as this character from the game or that character? For instance, you can actually do a pretty decent build of Aloth Corficer, one of the companions from the first two Pillars of Eternity games. You can actually make a character who is a lot like Aloth. And in fact, when I started one of my wizard playthroughs of Avowed, I named them basically Engfirth, which, if you remember from Pillars of Eternity 2, is a pretty important name associated with that character. And you're actually able to build a pretty decent backstory for why he might be quiet about his actual identity. But anyways, I'm getting lost in the sauce. That's a different episode for a different day, one I'm clearly interested in. But today, we're going to be talking about the Ghost Heart Ranger and all the associated lore with it, and how you can roleplay as one in Avowed. The only news to go over today would be that there's been a bug, or I guess a security breach noted with Obsidian games, or I guess it has to do with the Unity in particular, so that game engine that runs the, what is it? It's like the art book and all that for Grounded 2 as well as Avowed. There's some sort of security vulnerability in the Unity engine that is affecting those games. I haven't heard a lot about other games being affected. I haven't seen other publishers or developers pulling out of storefronts to be dealt with, so I don't know if it's an Obsidian specific thing, and I haven't really looked into it a lot. I have kind of been low effort in terms of keeping up with news across the spectrum, not just video game or Obsidian related. And other than that, I suppose that we have the Avowed final update coming up soon, or I don't know about final, but it's definitely coming up soon, and it's the last one that was in the roadmap that we had a year ago. And Outer Worlds 2 is also coming out, and as of today's recording, there was actually a live filmed trailer about the sequel to Outer Worlds 1, and that's actually kind of a big theme of the live action trailer. Very funny, definitely worth checking out, where Obsidian kind of pokes fun at themselves for being great at sequels and not much else, even though I would be one to disagree. But that's everything for today. Let's dive into the lore.
Half the locals would arrest you for trespassing and the rest would kill you outright. I'm curious, what exactly did you find there?
So today's lore comes mainly from a lot of different sources across the internet. I'm using the Pillars of Eternity fandom website as well as the Avowed Fextra Life Wikipedia website. And we're going to be talking about a number of different things. Primarily, the first thing moving forward that we should talk about is Rangers in general. Rangers are a very familiar class for those of us who have played a lot of fantasy role-playing games or consumed any sort of role-playing media in general. There are even books dedicated to the idea of Rangers. There's I can't remember the author of it, but there's an entire series of books called The Ranger's Apprentice. And, Rangers are often viewed as the masters of survival and living out in the woods, surviving off the land. They have a strong instinct for tracking and survival, etc., etc. And we see them a lot in fantasy role-playing games, whether that's video games or tabletop role-playing games like in Dungeons & Dragons. We're introduced to this class of character in Pillars of Eternity 1 as one of the main classes that you can play. And when you read what a ranger is, according to Eora's description as written by Obsidian, it says that rangers are warriors of the woodlands and masters of the hunt. Always partnered with a soul-bonded animal, they can be found in wild spaces all over the world. As their lifestyles often tend towards independence and isolation, it is rare for rangers to become an integral part of a large fighting force, though they are often employed as scouts and guides. So there's actually a decent amount to unpack in there, and I'm going to go through it a little bit just so we can kind of have a good understanding of who and what a ranger is within this world as we move forward. But Obsidian definitely plays on the regular trope of rangers being warriors of the woodlands and masters of the hunt. So, people that you find in forested regions who are surviving off the land, tracking animals, acting as guides, etc., etc. I would say the main thing that makes a ranger in this world is that they are partnered with a soul-bonded animal companion. That is the real big star of the show. That is the major piece of flavor that makes rangers different in Eora. Is not just that they have an animal companion, which is a commonly used trope, but it's not required as part of rangers and media in general. But it's not just an animal companion, it is a soul-bonded animal companion. The soul is a very important part of the narratives that we see in Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. The soul is a very real and concrete thing. It's not made out of carbon atoms like your body would be made of. It is made of something else called essence. And the soul can be interacted with, it can be measured, it can be looked into, and it can interact with other souls. And so when a hunter and an animal companion have a soul bond that ties them together on a spiritual and ethereal way, that reinforces their relationship, but it also comes with some drawbacks. So a hunter that has a soul bonded animal as their companion might benefit from having some of the extra senses that their animal has. So they might not be able to necessarily see through the animal's eyes at any given point in time, although that's certainly not out of the realm of possibility, but perhaps they will be able to have a sense of what they're feeling or thinking or what instinct they might have. So whereas you and I are walking through the woods and we're completely unaware of some sort of predator that might be nearby, our animal companion with, their basic animal instincts might be aware of it. And so all of a sudden, your animal starts getting a little bit nervous, and you can start to feel that innately in your own person. And you would be able to more easily work with what they're feeling to be able to figure out what's going on. Right? So there's a lot of interesting benefits that you could create in a game like this by having a soul-bonded animal companion. The drawback would be, obviously, if the animal is hurt or dies and anything like that occurs, it's going to affect you a lot more. And in fact, it does in the game of Pillars of Eternity. If your animal companion goes down in combat, even if they don't necessarily die, there is a affliction that is put upon that character. I believe it's called bonded grief, which is essentially, you're grieving the loss or the injury or the wound that this animal companion verse has sustained, and it's very much tied to who you are as a person. So it's got benefits, it's got drawbacks, and it's really interesting from a story-based perspective. As well in this description, it says their lifestyle often tends towards independence and isolation. It's rare for rangers to become an integral part of a large fighting force. I think this is pushing back against a lot of regularly used tropes in some fantasy media, and I've seen it a lot in Dungeons & Dragons, where rangers are employed by the earldom or the kingdom or whatever, and they kind of exist on the borderlands of the kingdom, trying to keep evil things out, act as kind of like the park rangers, if you will, or some sort of force for the kingdom that, enforces laws or reports back on information. They can act as spies or scouts and things like that. So I think that Obsidian has kind of designed rangers to not necessarily fill that role, even though they definitely can, and there are certain instances where they do, but they are often employed as scouts and guides. So, they leave that door open. Very typical of most ranger classes, they are usually equipped with a bow of some sort. That is the main way that that a lot of rangers are expressed in terms of combat, and so it's no surprise that a lot of rangers play in the game of Pillars of Eternity like that as well, and I think that it's also a really good build for rangers in the game of Avowed. Now, specifically, I want to focus in on one of the subclasses that we have access to in the second Pillars of Eternity game. For those unaware, in Pillars of Eternity 1, you don't really get access to subclasses. You can kind of multi-class in the sense that you get to have access to one or two different abilities or talents from different classes within the game. But in Pillars of Eternity 2, we got multi-classing in a proper way, where you can actually have access to two different classes and you can build on the abilities there. You'll never get to reach the top tier, abilities and talents in each of those classes, but you'll be able to play around and mix and match with a lot of them. And as part of multiclassing, we also got subclasses. So subclasses where, you picked Ranger and you had an opportunity to be an Arcane Archer or a Stalker or a Sharpshooter or a Ghost Heart Ranger. And each of them come with some sort of benefit, but they also come with some sort of penalty. So if you don't want to worry about the penalty, you could just go for a Ranger, no subclass, and not worry about it. Well, one of the options is Ghost Heart Ranger. And the reason I want to focus on this one, in particular, as we think about role-playing in Avowed, is I think becomes kind of obvious when you think it through. Ghost Heart Rangers are rangers whose animal companions have died, but remain in the in-between as spirits to serve their masters. Ghost Hearts can summon the spirit of their animal companion in combat for a limited duration. So as a benefit, as a bonus to being a Ghost Heart Ranger, you're immune to bonded grief because your animal has not actually died. They are in a spiritual form and caught in the in-between. What this means is there's a state between life and death called the in-between. So the animal hasn't really moved on into the afterlife, if you will, but they're not here alive in the real world. They're in between, and so that's where the in-between is. And they can still kind of live on as a spirit. And as a Ghost Heart Ranger yourself, you're able to summon the spirit of that companion into combat to help you out. Or if you're playing a game narratively at the table, you could probably summon the spirit to help out in guiding you through a forest or something like that. The focus being that it's only for a limited duration and they're of spiritual form. For those who have played Pillars of Eternity and who have played Avowed, I think it's obvious why I'm talking about the Ghost Heart Ranger, because when you ask the question of can you build a ranger in Avowed, the answer is very obviously yes, because there's an entire there's an entire ability tree in Avowed labeled Ranger, right? So you can obviously build a Ranger. But then the problem comes in, the main piece of flavor that makes a Ranger in the world of Eora is having a soul-bonded animal companion. So if you're building a Ranger in Avowed, which is supposed to be in the world of Eora, but you don't have an animal companion, that really takes away from what makes Rangers different than in other fantasy media. It would be a complete departure from what a Ranger is, and it would almost kind of be, not insulting, but it would kind of be not honoring the lore that's been established. And so being able to build a Ranger in the game of Avowed without an animal companion, while it's cool, it's like, yeah, but there's Rangers all over the place in other fantasy media. What makes this one special? And we established in Pillars of Eternity that what makes Rangers special is this animal companion. However, you don't have access to an animal companion in the game of Avowed. There's no such thing in order to do that. You don't have a little pet following you. It's not integral to the story. You're not soul bonded to it, even if you could have something following you around. So what are we going to do about that in Avowed if you wanted to roleplay as a Ranger? And obviously, taking inspiration from this Ghost Heart Ranger in the game of Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, we kind of get our answer. You can have kind of, I suppose, a headcanon, if you will, that your animal companion died at some point in time in the past, whether they died on the trip over to the Living Lands, or they died before you even started working for the Emperor, or what have you. At some point in the past, your animal companion died. But the animal companion did not pass over to the in-between, the beyond, where people go after that. It remains in the in-between. And so you still have this spiritual tenuous connection to this animal companion as a Ranger. Now, in my mind, I like to imagine it's a fairly recent thing because it would explain why you're not able to, quote-unquote, summon your animal companion at any point in time throughout the game of Avowed, because it's something you're fairly new to. As well, it might also be a reason why you would never talk about it in the game of Avowed, why it never comes up in the game of Avowed, because it's just such a fresh wound, and you're in a new place where nobody knows this about you, so you just don't tell anybody, and you're just trying to, like, live with it silently. You know, like, that's kind of my headcanon for this stuff. And this pairs really well as you grow and level in the game of Avowed, because eventually you get access to this ability where you can summon a spiritual bearer into the world. And I think that the narrative, at least in my head, of your character who is wrestling with the grief of having their animal lost, even though you can detect their spirit nearby, as you grow in your ability as a Ghost Heart Ranger, you start to learn that you actually can summon them as a spiritual form. And so, you know, that would obviously canonize in your head that the animal companion in question was a bear of sorts. But it's really cool that Obsidian included that as an option in making a ranger, that you could have this summonable bear as just an innate thing. And that really lines up well with what a ghost hunter ranger is in the world of Avowed.
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
I think there are some other obvious ways that you could build a ranger character in the game of Avowed at pulling from Pillars of Eternity 2 lore. The background for a Vanguard scout, I think, just makes completely obvious sense for something that would work based off what we read about rangers. You know, like, yes, your ranger could be a war hero. Yes, your ranger could be a noble scion. There's no reason that can't necessarily happen. But in terms of, like, how do we normally see rangers expressed in the world of Eora, Vanguard Scout is pretty obviously a way to do that. As well, pulling from Pillars of Eternity 2 in particular as inspiration for how to build the character, there is a lot of abilities in our ranger tree in Pillars of Eternity 2 that have to do with ranged abilities. So you have, like, Wounding Shot, where you can inflict damage that essentially, like, wounds a person and then they leave a trail of blood that you can follow. That's supposed to be the lore behind it. And you can technically do this with a melee weapon, if I remember correctly, but I think the idea is that you're supposed to use it with a ranged weapon, especially since an arrow is featured in the little icon for the ability itself. There's also abilities for evasive rolls, or evasive abilities in general. There are webbed arrows as well. You can mark enemies that you and your animal companion are meant to do better at defeating in combat, and this is all, again, in Pillars of Eternity 2. You have a brutal takedown, which your animal companion is supposed to do, but I suppose you could apply it to your own character. And then a lot of the abilities are just kind of building off of this as well, although there is a few that are pretty interesting and obvious to apply, such as the binding roots. A bunch of roots come out of the ground and just hold all your enemies down in a certain area. That obviously will match very well with Tanglefoot, one of the abilities you can get in the game of Avowed. And I think when you pair that with some of the abilities that Marius has, one of the companions in the game of Avowed, there are some of his roles and some of his active abilities that you can activate that I think match really well with what you can do in the games of Pillars of Eternity. And I'm not saying pretend that your character is doing them, but you could almost see it as like two rangers playing off of each other, of this other ranger who understands the same moves that you do, knows when to utilize them in combat, and you kind of synergize out in the wild. And so whether or not you like Marius necessarily, but we're thinking about roleplay here, and this is just kind of how I'm presenting it. Obviously, if you're role-playing a character, you can justify any kind of character build that you want. This is just where my mind's going with a lot of this. And so I think there's a lot of abilities that you could choose in Avowed that would make sense. Choosing the charge ability might be a good one, almost like you're being empowered by your animal companion to charge forward, especially if you are going to canonize that your animal companion used to be a bear. You could have things like constant recovery because you're very good at healing, you're very good at mitigating damage, or finding a way to recover from losing endurance or something like that. But I think obviously, and not surprisingly, that the majority of the abilities you're going to choose in Avowed would be from the Ranger tree. Obviously, selecting Bear Ally as soon as you get the chance, because that's supposed to be like your animal companion, which is stuck in the in-between. Choosing Critical Strike, because as a hunter, you always want to make sure you're making a one-shot kill on anything that you are chasing or hunting down. Evasive Ones, because that is actually some of the abilities that you have in Pillars of Eternity, Pillars of Eternity 2 especially. Things like Scavenger and Tanglefoot and Survivalist. I think all of these make a lot of good sense when building up a character in Avowed. And from those few abilities that I've already chosen, that actually takes up quite a lot of the abilities that you can have by the end of the game. And from there, you can kind of flavor the character the way you want for how your particular playstyle is, or if you're trying to do something different. I don't know that there would be a lot of use in any of the magic abilities. Perhaps, you could increase some of your, accumulation status effects, like you're good at inflicting fire damage or something, or you're good at inflicting cold damage. But as for the spells themselves, unless you can justify in your head that you would utilize some of these spells out in the woods, which I suppose you could very easily do, I don't know that your character would necessarily have those. Perhaps you might have Armored Essence just to, make your competency with light or medium armor a lot better, but again, I think that comes down to each individual person's kind of approach when building the character. Now, as far as how you would build the character in terms of what they wear and what they use, I think most of it's pretty obvious. When I started building a ranger character in this playthrough for preparing this episode, I settled down on wolf armor as the armor that I want to use. I figured you'd want to use some light armor or medium armor for its tactical purposes within the wild, but also I wanted it to match with kind of the flavor of the character I was building. And the wolf armor is a unique set of light armor that increases your perception and also increases damage reduction when you're sprinting, which kind of sort of makes sense. I imagine a ranger doesn't want to sprint around too much, but still. The description for wolf armor is: adorned with numerous wolf teeth and claws, this tanned leather was once the hide of an elder wolf of monstrous proportions. Despite being made years ago, and no matter how much one tries to clean it, the faint odor of lupine musk still clings to this armor. Both the reflexes and the senses of the wearer are owned by what remains of this once great wolf's soul, still clinging to its own remains. Rumor has it that wearing this armor can also cause one to feel a fierce sense of loyalty and kinship to one's companions, but there is nothing supporting this claim. So as far as lore goes here, that you have an elder wolf being something that exists, which just could be a very, the alpha wolf in a pack. The idea that you would have this fierce sense of loyalty and kinship to your companions while wearing this armor does have some credibility to it, even though they say there's nothing supporting the claim here. Because again, everything in this world, there's souls everywhere. Like everyone has souls, and souls is made up of essence. But essence is also very much part of any sort of organic material. And so the essence that's inside of this wolf armor, even though it's not a living, breathing wolf, that essence could have soaked within it, a sense of loyalty in it, to, put it in plain terms. And so it is kind of credible that that kind of thing would happen. As well, I figured that if you had this armor that had the faint odor of lupine musk on it, I figured that there was some way that a ranger could use that to their advantage. The only disadvantage I could see is that maybe it would attract other wolves to you, but perhaps because you have this musk, maybe they would, hesitate to attack you. So I'm not sure, but I thought wolf armor seems to make sense. I like the way and the flavor for it in building a ranger in the game, and so that's the one I chose. It also happened to be one that you can kind of get fairly early. You can get it in the second biome for the game, so you can actually get this early on in the game and actually hold on to it. As far as weaponry goes, I think obviously you want to go with a bow because that's very typical of a ranger and no sense ruining a good thing, right? For me, I would choose the long touch specifically because you can get it very early on in the game. And also, I think out of the 3 unique bows, it matches in terms of lore a little bit better than the other 2 ones do. The long touch, if you read the item description there, tells a story about an old hunter from Glonfoth, which is a tribal nation that exists on a continent far away from the Living Lands, and is actually a tribal nation that you get to interact with in the first Pillars of Eternity game. So an old hunter from Glonfoth crafted this bow as a coming-of-age present for his granddaughter, using wood freely given from a Delimgun's tree and a horn from an elder stag. A Delimgun is one of the enemies that you see in Avowed, but you actually see him in all 3 games pretty evenly. So the wood freely given from a Delumgum's tree is almost like them giving you a part of themselves to make a weapon with. So that's a pretty big deal. Now, I've talked about the long touch before on other episodes, so I'm not going to go deep into this. Long story short, her grandfather passes away, and this woman who owns this bow that he made for her, she kind of broke inside, and so she started hunting more and more dangerous prey and became addicted to the thrill of the hunt, and it kind of seeped into the bow itself, that malice that she feels or that anger, and it makes the bow actually better to use, and you have a better chance of actually hitting critical hits within the game. And that's kind of how the lore works for gaminess as well. And the description for this finishes off saying that people who use this when scoring a particularly brutal kill can sometimes hear faint whispers of triumph in their head. And I love that little flavor that Obsidian puts into their games, on not just the gaminess, but a little bit of flavor about how the world works. Aside from having a bow, you're obviously going to want to also have some sort of melee weaponry or some sort of tool that you would use, and I thought having a shield, maybe a small shield, and an axe would make the most sense. You could argue that a shield would be a little bit too much to carry around, but that's up to you to decide. I went with woodman's labor because it made sense that a ranger would want to have a basic axe with them, but it also serves pretty well as a decent weapon to use within the game. And I went with the Tree of Life as the shield, not for any reason except for the fact that it seemed really rangery. I'm not going to go into details on these because there's not much there other than, like I said, flavor, but they are pretty interesting on their own. Tree of Life is nice because it does help you regenerate up to 30% of your maximum health, and I think that would be very useful if you were, in fact, a ranger. But then you have other decisions that you can make within the game. Within Avowed, you're able to choose the different god totems that your character, activates, for lack of a better word, and they have boons for you as the player character. There's Woodica, there's Skain, there's Wal, and then there's Galawain. Now, if you're familiar with the other gods of this world, the obvious choice as a ranger is Galawain, Lord of the Hunt in all of its forms, and just that title alone, I think, really gets off the idea of why. That was a phrasing, but whatever, really gets across the idea why that Galawain would be an ideal choice for a ranger to worship and follow, because you would want blessings from the god of the hunt in all of its forms. Now, unfortunately, you don't get all of the stuff for Galawain until the final biome of the game, so for the first 3 biomes, you have to ask yourself what kind of deity would my character want to follow necessarily. And I think you could make an argument for any of them. I usually just stick with Woodica for a while because, well, your character comes from Adir, and Woodica is like the state religion god in Adir. So it makes sense that your character would stick with Woodica for a while, and then you pick one of the other ones as they come along. So that's just kind of my default way of doing things in this game if I'm doing a roleplay. Some interesting items to think about having as you build up a ranger character in Avowed. Cartographer's Companion was one that I thought was a pretty good one. This is a compass that hangs off the end of a heavy leather cord, and it might be a bit heavy, but it's undeniably useful. Not only can you find one's way when you're lost in the wild, but it also has an enchantment that helps the wearer's footing to notice important details in the environment. So when mapping the land is your business, being prepared to handle whatever challenges that the land sends you is a matter of life and death. At least this is kind of what the description on the website says. And I think that as a ranger who is navigating the lands, especially an area that you perhaps have never been to before, having something with that enchantment that helps you perceive things better, it literally gives you a +2 in perception, makes a lot of sense. And so I chose that for my item that for this build. That's the one I would use, but unfortunately it's something you get later in the game, so you have to make do with something else in the meantime. And lastly, as far as just like items go, if you're interested in doing a build, I chose Forager's Friend as one of the rings in the game because it restores your health more with food that you cook at your camp, and I feel like a ranger would do that. It's also a crudely shaped wooden ring, and so I could almost see your character making this ring themselves out in the woods and then somehow enchanting it like this. Or perhaps as you are carving it next to the campfire, you're whittling this ring, but you're also cooking food. This like competency almost seeps into the essence of the wood itself. I know it doesn't necessarily work that way, but this is just kind of how in my head I'm justifying it. which is funny kind of way to think about it, because this ring specifically says in its item description that this helps people live off the land, especially for people who aren't very good at it. So there's a little bit of dissonance there, but that I think that's besides the point. But yeah, that's the main way I would build this character, and I would think about approaching in terms of like how a ranger works in the game of Avowed, based off of what we know about rangers from the lore established in Pillars of Eternity. I'm not going to go into much more detail because as much as I enjoy actually building these characters in the game, this is more of a lore program, so I should probably stick to some of that. Plus, a lot of people on the internet are much better at building these characters than I am and have viable builds that will get you to the end of the game, whereas I'm just thinking about roleplay. Some of my roleplay characters would not be able to handle Path of the Damned because things get a little hard and I'm not optimizing it for combat as good as I should. But that's everything that I want to bring forward in terms of making a Ghost Heart Ranger in the game of Avowed. Now, again, like I've gone through some of these items on what makes a good build for, a ranger feel, but honestly, most of the stuff I picked was just that ranger flavor, a person who is a master of exploring the woods and taking down predators and surviving, etc., etc. They can act as a scout or a guide in the world. Right, so a lot of the stuff that you pick in the game of Avowed just kind of has to like match your vision of what a person like that might be, and you might pick very different things than me. The important thing, in my mind anyways, for creating a ranger in the game of Avowed is how does it match that really vital, important piece of the soul-bonded animal companion. You could also try to make an argument that something happened to your animal companion before you were shipped off to the living lands, and they were grievously injured, and so they weren't actually able to make the trip back. They wouldn't survive the trip to the living lands with you, and so you had to leave them behind in a deer. How might that affect the ranger character throughout the game of Avowed? How does that affect how you operate in the world and how you behave as a ranger while you're there? And does it have any sort of negative side effects? Right, so I went with the Ghost Heart route where your animal companion died, it was a bear, and you can summon a bear ally later in the game, and I justified that headcanon because it happened recently. But you could definitely build a ranger character in another way where you just say that like they were injured and they're back at home being taken care of by, some sort of animal doctor, which I know is called a vet in real life, but I don't know what they would call them back in the day. I say back in the day like this is a thing that actually happened. I mean, like, based off of the Renaissance period when this was, when Eora was based off of. I don't know what they called doctors for animals. Was it just vets? Regardless, your animal companion could be back in Adir being taken care of by some sort of professional in the king's court while you are off fulfilling his mission as a ranger in the living lands. So that's a way you could headcanon that as well. But that is definitely the most vital part. I love the classes in Obsidian's games for Pillars of Eternity and Avowed because they take something that is fairly, I would say, tropey in a lot of other fantasy media, but they put a spin on something, or they add one very unique thing that makes them different. Like monks in the World of Eora, the big thing that makes a monk in Eora is that they live and feed off of pain to embolden their spirit and soul to perform the supernatural abilities that they perform. And for a ranger, the really unique thing is that soul-bonded animal companion. And so if you are thinking about playing a tabletop role-playing game in the World of Eora and you want to build a ranger character, that is the vital thing for you to think about. Who is your animal companion and what is your relationship with them? How did the soul bond? Things like that. And the GM of the game or the Dungeon Master, if you're playing D&D, need to really take that into account and maybe add some homebrew rulings in about how that works mechanically. But yeah, aside from that, that's just role-playing the game in Avowed. But let's stop here and close off the episode.
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
I'm going to make this quick because I ordered pizza for delivery and it arrived, and so my family's eating it without me, and that will simply just not do. So if you enjoyed today's episode, hope you did, please send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. If you didn't enjoy today's episode, or you thought some things were missing, or there's some critiques or questions or comments that you have, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. If you have any other ideas for how you could build a ranger in the game of Avowed based off of the lore from Pillars of Eternity, some insights that you think are good, or other different like headcanon thoughts on the roleplay, please send me your thoughts because I'm actually genuinely interested in this stuff, and I know other people are too, and I can take those ideas and spread them out. worldofeora@gmail.com is the place to do all of that. If you want to follow the show on Twitter, you can do so at World of Eora. I mostly just post updates on when episodes are out or if something's going to happen that you need to know about, so it's a quick place to get a hold of me or see if there's any updates. If you would like to support this show, you can do so at ko-fi.com/worldofeora. I don't expect listeners to do that. It's just something I have available for those who find value in supporting the things and content that they like to enjoy. And every little bit helps. It helps justify, obviously, like continuing the show for as long as it has. And I appreciate that for anyone who does it. But it's definitely not something that I want to impose. If you do want to support the show, but you don't want to do so financially, I 100% understand and respect that. If you are wanting to support the show, the other thing you can do is engage with the platform that you're listening to this on. So if you're on Spotify, leave a comment, or if I have a question posted, answer the question. If you're on iTunes, leave a review and leave a 5-star preferably, but you can give whatever star you think is worthy of it. And that helps the show get recommended to other people that listen to the same things that you listen to. And that would really help the show reach other people. As for what I've been playing lately, I don't remember if I talked about it last episode or not. I started playing Code Vein just as a game to play where I'm going from... It's not Bonfire, but it's a Dark Souls-y game, so I say Bonfire just as a default. And I've just been kind of going from one to the next every day that I play. That game is full of fan service. If you're aware of anime and what fan service means, it's actually quite ridiculous, but I've been enjoying the game a little bit. But I'm still mostly focusing on tabletop role-playing games. I quite literally have a box right next to me right now full of books that I have got in the last month. I have spent an ungodly amount of money on these things, but it is what it is. And so right now, my table has voted on 4 games that they are wanting to run one-shots in. So I am reading through the rules and developing adventures for Cairn, Mouse Ritter, Mothership, and Grok, which is a little favorite of mine. And so I've been kind of writing adventures for them. I'm also going to use the modules that came with a lot of these games for my table to run one-shots. And then after we do some one-shots in that, we're going to jump into our next fully formed campaign for the next 2 years, which will be set in a followed-ized version of the city that we live in. But if any of you out there, you tabletoppers out there, have played any of those games, whether it's Cairn, Mothership, Mouse Ritter, or Grok, and you have any insights, or you have any thoughts, or you have any resources you want to throw my way, please do, as I might have been GMing for the last couple of years, but I'm very new at it, and I've only had experience in Powered by the Apocalypse system, so I have to really adjust to these new systems, even though I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, thanks everyone for listening to this episode. That's everything. If you did have any insights on those tabletop games, worldofeora@gmail.com. Really do appreciate it. But that's going to do for today. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode where we dove deep into the Ghost Heart Ranger specifically and how you can roleplay as one in Avowed. And if you wanted to roleplay as a different kind of ranger in Avowed, there really is ways to, headcanon that. I'm more interested in how we can do so mechanically with what exists within Avowed, but whatever you want to do, you can make it work. That's what we focused on today. Hope you liked the episode. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.